Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Oraculos podcast, where I bring you ancient wisdom for the modern mystic. I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, and joining me today, all the way from California, is Mr. Henry Seltzer. Henry, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Henry, I'm super excited about the conversation that we're going to be having this evening. But before we get there, for those of you who this is your first time joining us here on the Oraculos podcast, this is a podcast where I bring you interviews from astrologers and mystics from all around the world who aren't just changing their own lives through their astrological practice, but they're also actively impacting the greater field of astrology that we all know and love. So if you want to continue to be a part of the magic and the momentum that we're building here on the Oraculos podcast, please do go down below, hit the like button, and also hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you receive notifications of when I bring you these interviews each and every week. If you're going to be listening to this over on Anchor FM, please make sure to go down below, check out the Anchor link so that you can listen to this podcast on whatever audio-only podcast platforms you use. All right, Henry, once again, thank you so much for taking time out to meet with me.
My pleasure.
Now, Henry, you and I, we met at the Astrology and World Event Summit that was hosted by the Astrology University earlier in the fall. And we met at the end of, I think it was Stephen Forrest's talk on Eris, yes?
Yes.
And I was looking at some of the comments you were making in the chat box while the talk was running, and I was really intrigued that someone there seemed to know just as much about Eris as the presenter of that talk. So I was really looking forward to have a further conversation with you because I think we all felt very strongly impacted at the end of that presentation. So I'm happy that you're here because I know that you're going to give us the download, not just on Eris, but also on many other things that are floating in our Kuiper Belt. So I can't wait to dive in.
Very good.
Good. Now, Henry, before we dive into that conversation, I want you to tell our listeners and viewers who you are, where you are, and also what brought you into astrology and what's kept you here for all these years.
Well, I started out from the physical sciences. I actually have a bachelor's degree from MIT, and I was a physics major at one point, but I've always had a foot in each world. When I say each world, I mean both the technical scientific framework, but also the humanities, which are a very important way of arriving at truth. As I began to realize, and I diverged a little bit from my beginnings and got into various things. But astrology was really perfect for me because it involves all that technical side of being perfectionistic about the position we're talking about and the angles it makes, the angles the planets make to each other. But yet, coming at it from a mystical standpoint, which I think is a greater truth, really, than just what we have. And it is a miraculous thing. You know, the planets are just out there. They're doing their thing. They're going through their orbits. And yet, we can use the information about how they line up and where they line up against the zodiac, and we can find out things. And it's just miraculous. It's the universe speaking back to us. So I think that's just fantastic. And I think it's a stepping stone to the next society, the society that's emerging in this 21st century.
And Henry, I had said to you before we went on air that your software and your program, Astrograph, was the very first software that I had ever used. And it was the very first thing that I had downloaded on my cell phone. So can you tell our listeners and viewers a bit about your role as an astrological software creator?
Well, at the time, when I say at the time, it was the 80s. I was, the microcomputers had just come along at that time. And people were doing astrology on microcomputers in various ways. And my thought was that I didn't really like any of the user interfaces that I was being confronted with. I wanted to have something that was really easy for people to use. I wanted to make it really clear how you could bring up information about your chart if you were a beginner, and you could learn something not only about astrology, but about yourself and how in the world that could possibly work. And therefore, magic is afoot. It's a lot more a lot more full and beautiful universe than we could imagine from just the technology and just the materialistic worldview. So that's really, I founded the company. I founded my company Astrograph Software, and I also, the software is called Time Passages on the, now it's on the iPhone, but of course at the time it was on first MS-DOS, then Windows, then Macintosh, and we have a Unix version. So we have all these platforms that we have to maintain, including Android and now the mobile platforms, So, but it's been a labor of love because I just really feel like it's important for people to recognize that astrology works. Astrology gives us information, and it's just a miracle that it does.
Now, moving beyond your life as a software creator, can you also talk to us a little bit about your specific approach to astrology and how that's been informed through the discovery of the Kuiper Belt objects?
Well, sure, that's a leap too, because at the beginning, the thing that I was describing to you, my love of astrology and my intention to bring it to a wider audience through software was really based on the modern humanistic Western astrology as really articulated by Dane Rudhyar, one of my first authors that I ever paid attention to. And then people that have come along in that same vein, I'm thinking of people like Liz Green, psychological astrology, Stephen Arroyo, quite a few people that have really been able to plumb the depths of how astrology really relates to the depths of each human being, along the lines of Carl Jung, who was really the one that articulated in terms of psychology what there was within the human being, within the human psyche, that had not really been very clear before he started, before the beginning of the 20th century.
So, would you call the shape of your astrology psychological astrology or modern astrology, or how would you phrase that?
Yeah, I think modern humanistic astrology is the way to phrase it for me. And then you're asked the question about Eris. So when Eris came along, it was discovered, and they said, well, we're going to call those guys out in the Kuiper Belt, we're going to call them dwarf, right? To distinguish them from the other planets. And no, we don't have 9 planets anymore. We only have 8, and everybody's all confused and upset about that because they had to classify Pluto, which had been discovered in the 1930s, early 1930s. They had to classify that along with these other Kuiper Belt objects that were emerging. And they didn't want there to be that many Kuiper Belt planets to add to the number of planets. How many? It's a cosmology issue. See, how many planets do we have? 9, 10, no, 12, no, next year 15. It was getting to be too variable, and they wanted to make it was really a political move on the part of the astronomers, the International Astronomical Union, to make a distinction between the ones that we recognize as our fond understanding of where we are in the universe, and we have Uranus and Neptune and Pluto, but no, we can't have Pluto because they had to make a special category. So, but I took it the other way. I got very interested. Here's a new planet, just as big as Pluto, maybe more important in the Kuiper Belt. What would be the impact in charts? So I was right from the very beginning in 2006, interested in pursuing that idea that my scientific brain said, well, if there is a discovery such as in the 1700s, Uranus, in the 1800s, Neptune, in the early 1900s, Pluto, and now in the very beginning of the 21st century, 2006, we have, another planet. This is a significant event worthy of doing research. And to me, it takes the research to figure out what is the meaning of the planet, how does it really work with charts. And what I came up with was that Eris is a feminine warrior because it was the sister mythology of the god of war. So I thought that was my initial take on it, that was a feminine warrior. And then I started trying to understand, how is a feminine warrior different from the regular warrior that we think of with, macho and, sword play and I'm the best, I'm the biggest, that a feminine warrior works from a really deep need. It's only in response. I think of a woman, might be a mother, might have a bread knife in her hand, an intruder comes and there's child at risk, she might use that knife. But that kind of warrior to defend her principles that are so important to her and her child is different from a warrior that is really striking out for the idea of warrior, the idea of being a warrior. So, and then when I started investigating the feminists, for example, I couldn't find a feminist leader of the past couple of centuries that didn't have strong Eris. So I began to realize that it really is, and paradigm shifters also, people like Einstein that come along, they have a deep understanding of what has to happen that really overrides anything else, and they have to act upon it. So what I came to, and it's really important for our times, each individual has within them principles that they really cannot ignore. And when you go for it, you really understand what you're about, what it's for, what your life is about. And so I think of Eris as a feminine warrior for soul intention or in support of soul purpose. And you kind of find out what you're supposed to be doing. You know, you kind of find out if you really do the research within yourself and look at your position. You can look at the position of Eris in your chart. It's very helpful because that house position that Eris occupies turns out to be an important house just by the factor of Eris being there. And in fact, when I started writing up the interpretations for Eris by house, I found so much response. You know, people would say, my gosh, you really nailed it. That's me. And I've cut out this interpretation that you've given me, and first in the book and then later in the software. And I put that up on my wall because I feel like it's so such a great deep representation of what's going on for me. So I kind of found that I was really onto something, and I wrote the book, and it's been a progress since then. People are gradually accepting that idea, and to some extent, to greater or lesser extent.
Now, Henry, talk to us about the concept of the Kuiper Belt objects. I know what they are, but I want to give you the opportunity to tell our listeners and viewers who may not be familiar with the concept of the Kuiper Belt or the objects beyond Pluto about what they are. So what are the Kuiper Belt objects? What is the Kuiper Belt, and why should we even be paying attention to it?
Well, that's a very interesting point you raised because there's many objects out there. It's not just one or two. There is a whole, that's why they call it a belt, sort of similar to the asteroid belt that exists between Mars and Jupiter, of course. The Kuiper Belt is beyond Neptune. And you can actually tell something about some of these orbits from the orbit of Neptune. So they are beyond Neptune, called trans-Neptunians at times, called KBOs or Kuiper Belt objects at times. But I'm making a distinction within all that vast number of objects of different sizes, by the way. The four largest known have been officially named by the IAU as planets. You know, there's Pluto, which we've always used in Western astrology ever since it was first discovered in the 30s. And then Eris is this also just as big as Pluto, slightly smaller, Haumea and Makemake. And they're named after indigenous gods and goddesses, fascinatingly. And then to go on, there are further candidates out there, but the IAU has no immediate plans to name more of them officially as quote unquote dwarf planets. So I began to think that these ones that are officially named, because, you know, we work with the astronomers discover Uranus, for example, the first time that they discovered a new planet after the ancients that knew about the visible planets. And it becomes something that's in the zeitgeist and becomes important in astrology, and we start to use it and understand its meaning a little bit different from the mythology of its naming. And so on with Neptune and then with Pluto. And now these new ones, I find it fascinating that they're officially named, and there are other objects that I haven't really done much research. Other astrologers have been doing research with some of these other objects that are out there that are, you might call them dwarf planet candidates, but they haven't been officially named. So I picked these four because, you know, Pluto we're already working with. These other three, I feel are just really kind of significant, the fact that they're official. They're also the biggest of them. So that's what I've been working with.
Now, how do you feel about the asteroids, because the asteroids are also a very big factor within the landscape of modern Western astrology. So we know that we have Chiron, which is between Saturn and Uranus. So it's not quite a Kuiper Belt object. It's not a Kuiper Belt object, but it is there as well. And then we have the four asteroid goddesses that
Yeah.
a lot of people use. How do you feel about including them within the landscape of our Western astrology?
Well, you know what I wind up doing? It's interesting that the four major asteroids in the asteroid belt itself, as you refer to them, Juno, Vesta, Pallas, and what would be the other one?
Ceres.
Ceres, of course, yes, which is the biggest actually, and which has gotten dwarf planet status now recently. But it's interesting that there's four major asteroids that have emerged as carrying meaning as far as Western astrology goes. And now in this other belt of objects that are of all sizes, including tiny, there's four major ones that have emerged and been given names, as far as officially classified as planets. So I think that's quite interesting. Now, the other group of objects that you refer to, which are called centaurs, actually, they're not called asteroids. They are between the known planets, Saturn and so on, and the outer planets, Uranus. And then, Chiron connects the orbits, really by its own orbit being further and further out, connects the orbits of Saturn and Uranus. Pholus connects the orbits of Saturn and Neptune. And then Nessus connects us to Pluto. So those three seem to have significance as far as the centaurs are concerned, and how they connect up the outer planets to the known planets. So that's another very interesting field of study. And of course, Chiron is definitely very important in Western astrology. Everybody is very aware of that, I think, by this point in time. And these others are too.
Now, another planet that's been making its way into the headlines recently is Sedna. And I haven't heard you speak about Sedna within the body of the planets that you're focusing on right now. Why is that?
Well, there's two reasons. One is, if you think about it, there's these quote-unquote dwarf planets that the IAU has designated as planets. And that does not include Sedna. Sedna was discovered, and you could consider it perhaps a dwarf planet category. Also, the orbit of Sedna goes way, way out there, and it's quite a few thousand years, rather than, there's kind of a progression. When we talk about the planets beyond Saturn that have been discovered, Uranus was 84-year orbital period. And then 192 years, we have Neptune. Then Pluto, 248 years. These other three are kind of in a similar vein. There's 284 years and 309 years, representing Maki and Haumea. And then finally, the one that's further out of all of them, of the four that I'm describing, is Eris, which has an orbital period of 559 years, which is kind of double Pluto. So to me, it's quite interesting that they have those same kind of numbers of years, whereas Sedna is, like I say, I think it's thousands, I don't know. And I haven't done the research much on Sedna. Again, I was limiting. I mean, there's also a few other objects out there that astrologers have written about in very interesting ways. I'm sure there's an interest there. And Sedna is an interesting object for sure. But my focus has been the ones that were officially designated as planets, just because I just feel that there's a synchronicity there between the ones that are named and the ones we start to work with in Western. So that's the way I've been doing it.
Within the body of our Western tropical astrology, do you think that this inclusion of these Kuiper Belt objects, or are we calling them planets at this point?
Well, I like to call them planets.
Okay.
And the reason I do is because if you think about it, we have different designations within astrology than the strict astronomy. For example, we have the sun and the moon, which are not in the category of planets. Then we have Mercury, Venus, and Mars, which of course are literally planets. And then beyond them, we have other planetary, but there's different distinctions that we have within astrology than the pure astronomy. Now, when we come to these Kuiper Belt objects, Pluto, we wouldn't want to say is anything but a planet. I mean, when we talk about the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, it's very clear in our own understanding of how they work together and how the Uranus-Pluto cycle is so important, as well as the Saturn-Pluto cycle that we're experiencing in this 2020 timeframe, so important. So, I mean, to me, calling Pluto anything but a planet is silly. And then as far as Western astrology goes, and then when you get to Eris, there's no distinction in the astronomical categories between Eris and Pluto, so I call it a planet. And by extension, these other two, Haumea and Makemake. And then, of course, the question becomes, are they actually significant in charts? But not only have I found significance to Eris that I can give you some stories when we get into it. I can spot the archetype. I really understand it. And similarly, I'm beginning to understand the archetypes for Haumea and Makemake, so I do consider them planets, and in the astrological sense.
So, in the same way as we refer to Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto as being the outer planets, is there now a new subcategory for us to give to Eris, Haumea, and Makemake?
That's a very good question, and I think that really depends on how they become, what the impact. That's probably a question for 20 years from now, when we become a little bit more familiar with them. I don't know how they will shake out. You could say that they're all outer planets. You could say that maybe there's something about those initial three, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Eris is kind of in its own category because it's very important in charts. I think it's just as important as Pluto in charts. I know that sounds unlikely, but it seems to be the case, and I could explain. Makemake and Haumea may be a little bit of a lesser characterization, like demigods instead of gods, perhaps. But, basically, they're all important archetypes.
Do you think that the future of our Western tropical astrology is to move in a direction where we include them into the root of our Western astrology in the same way as Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto have been included into the very foundation of our Western modern astrology? Do you think that we're moving to a place where we include these new outer planets into that same foundation?
Yes.
Okay.
I'll tell you, Eris is so important. I mean, would you like an example?
Yes, please.
Greta Thunberg started speaking up, and she was exemplar of this feminine warrior for soul intention that I have already characterized. I did not have to look at her chart to know that there was a powerful presence of Eris in her chart. The archetype stands out, and sure enough, square the sun and moon. It's a yod from Makemake, which is one of these other new ones, and Mars to Eris, which is also in a grand trine with Pluto and Jupiter. So it's pretty dramatically present. But it wasn't that I thought, maybe I'll look at this chart, and maybe I find Eris there. It was more, I could see Eris in her activity. Here she is, a 15-year-old addressing the UN, the leaders of the world, telling them they're screwing up. She's passionate, she's powerful. She doesn't take any bull BS about anything. She's, a warrior. You could see she's a warrior, for her cause, which was something she deeply believed in. And then when we get into the meaning of Makemake, we find that there is an environmental activism slant to the Makemake archetype as well. So seeing that in partile quincunx, and then with Mars at 21, Makemake at 19 of Virgo, and then Eris at 19 degrees of Aries. So it's actually a partile quincunx between Makemake and Eris. And then the whole thing is a very tight yod to Eris. So, I mean, that's only confirmation of what I could just see, and I see it all the time. I don't know if you know anything about Terence McKenna.
Yes. Yes, I do.
Well, interestingly, I was giving a lecture in San Francisco about Eris, and somebody raised their hand and said, have you looked at the chart of Terence McKenna? And I said, well, no, I haven't, but I'm sure that's strong Eris. I can guarantee it 100%. He's like an iconoclastic person, his own way of looking at things, passionate about it, articulate about it, spoke about his own ideas about how human civilization came from psilocybin spores that were from asteroids that hit the earth. And Archaic Revival was the book he wrote about bringing ancient wisdom back into currency in these modern times, how important that is. And just as soon as they raised the question, I thought, oh, of course. And it happens all the time. I'm always saying, oh, another one is Marianne Williamson.
Williamson.
Yeah, and she is such a strong advocate for what she believes. And I just the other day thought about, oh, I bet she does have strong Eris, and found that very, very strong. It's a partile opposition to Saturn and partile square to Chiron. So it's a T-square with Eris opposite Saturn to Chiron and Capricorn. I mean, you just after a while, I know it so well. I can see it or Kobe Bryant is another one. He was a very strong competitor, and he got in trouble with women sometimes for being so competitive and strong. And somebody was telling me in a bar, I don't like the Lakers because I don't like Kobe Bryant. He's just too powerful, too strong. He's too much of a whatever. And I thought, well, that's Eris. And sure enough, he has Eris conjunct Mars opposite Pluto, I believe is what it is with him. So, I mean, just you see it and you know it. And by the time I've worked with it so much, it's just, and along the lines, I believe, of soul intention. It's what is the thing that I cannot not do? What must I be to be comfortable? I must do this. And then I'm okay. Then I'm feeling like I'm in my purpose. So it's really pretty important archetype.
Now, Henry, the other side of the astrological divide is more than likely going to say that, well, we could have found out those things about Greta from the other factors that are active within her chart, or we could have seen those things about Kobe from the Mars opposite Pluto by itself as a standalone factor. So I think the question is, do you think that it is absolutely necessary for us as we move forward to integrate these new outer planets into the fabric of our astrology? Or do you think that astrology, being the holographic thing that it is, has the ability to show us exactly who a person is within our current astrological framework, and using the new outer planets only serves as further confirmation of things that the chart would have already said in any event?
Well, no, I don't think it's that these archetypes don't count. It really enhances both or three of the examples that I gave you. In other words, just having Pluto opposite Mars, but having Eris, which represents, again, that really strong. It's a fighter. It's somebody that's very strong in their impressions. And I can tell you numerous. Well, if you read the book, anyway. So yes, I think picture this. Picture before the discovery of Pluto. And then you want to know, well, okay, this object was found way the heck out there, this little tiny thing. When we have some idea of what the archetype seems to represent, do you think we should really add this to the astrological canon? I mean, we're doing fine, And so, well, it is a unique archetype that has come. And furthermore, what else? It is also an archetype that really reflected some of the 20th century angst. It was discovered in the 30s when Nazis were on the rise, when the atomic bomb had just been created as part of, well, before the atomic bomb actually was developed and deployed, but it's part of that whole time frame that it came into being, as are, of course, Neptune was discovered at a time when spiritualism and the idea that there is life beyond this life, and Uranus, similarly, the revolutionary spirit of the 1700s, late 1700s, where you had both the American and the French Revolution. And of course, now you can see the combinations in that fabulous book by Rick Tarnas, Cosmos and Psyche, where he talks about all the combinations of those planets. Now, those are much better understood and much more part of our current Western astrology for sure. But I do find, as iconoclastic as that notion is, I do find that Eris has a very characteristic meaning. And I think another question becomes, what is the meaning of these new planets in our times? And do we see the woman warrior, the assertive woman leader on the rise in these times of our early 20th century? And of course, look at 2018 when we saw so many women running for office, or look at the fact that after the election of what's his name, the jerk in the White House, we do find that there was this huge Women's March on Washington, which was terrific. So there's been a huge reaction to Trump, and part of that came from women, from the idea that you have to take that seriously. Just because she's a woman and just because she might be lovely doesn't mean she's not somebody strong. In fact, there's a book that has a really nice cover on it that I found in a bookstore recently. Strong is the New Pretty. So, I mean, I just feel like its time has come. It reflects what's happening in the world around us. And I have written articles that came out in Mountain Astrology. There's a couple of articles I did on Eris. The second one was in April 2015 about Eris as reflecting in the charts of paradigm shifters. So there's a lot of evidence also about how it really does stack up, and then the book.
Do you think that our discovery of these new outer planets and even beyond that is going to essentially add to our understanding of natal astrology strongly, or do you think that its strongest effect is going to be in mundane astrology, since we're referring to such larger cycles of time?
Well, the cycles of time, that's a good point, of course. That was a concern of mine. I didn't think it was going to be possible to look at transiting Eris. Eris is very important in natal astrology, and I think these other two will be also, Haumea and Makemake. In fact, that was what I started to say. Was there's an article that just came out in the most recent April, the April 2020 edition of the Mountain Astrologer, where I described some of the evidence for these new planets as kind of emblems of profound connection with nature and natural law. And there's a lot to go into, so maybe I won't go into the details of that. But I do think that these other two as well, which only makes sense, right? Because we have this category. We have Pluto, we have Eris, and the other two in the same category of KBO planets that are officially named planets are Haumea and Makemake, and they are named after indigenous gods and goddesses. Haumea is a very beautiful rendition of nature herself. It was the Hawaiian mythology. She was the mother of Pele and the mother of the creation goddess of a lot of the Hawaiian mythology. And she had a wand that could make food appear, which sounds a lot like the nature of the islands, where you can have food anywhere you look. And also, she could regenerate after giving birth as a young woman, which again, to me, represents kind of a fundamental idea of nature, always changing, always creating, always, never still, always coming up with new forms. And I think nature is a very important factor for us, recognizing our part in nature and nature being part of us. And also, right now, we have the environmental movement that we recognize that climate change, I mean, you can't think of an issue that's more important in today's society than the idea that we have to protect nature and that we are part of nature and nature is part of us, and we really need to understand that connection better. So I do think that they come along at a time when people are ready for it. And then I can see it in the charts of people that are very nature oriented. For example, Joseph Campbell. In his natal chart, we find a tremendous presence of Haumea. And he went to the Wild West shows of the early 1900s. He was born 1909, I think, I'm not sure. But he went to those shows and he was rooting for the Indians, not the cowboys, and he actually was very interested in the totem poles. And also he had a whole period of time where he went through really identifying natural things like the flora and fauna, of the Pennsylvania woods, where he spent some time. So he was connected to nature. And then his whole study of mythology, which is where he gave his life effort, really, he said the purpose of mythology was to connect us as a human race to nature. So I just think yes, it's very important in natal, as well as, as these archetypes are. You wouldn't say Pluto is not important in natal, although we can talk about the cycles. Oh, and then the other thing, just one more thing, is that even the transits of Eris, as slow as they are, because it's so far out there, it moves very slowly through Aries, especially, which is where it is right now, the aphelion of its orbit. Those transits turn out to be meaningful as well. I've got tons of examples of that. So, yeah, they're pretty important.
Okay, now you mentioned transits. What are the other predictive techniques that you use within your work that may potentially speed up these new outer planets? So are we also looking at solar arc directions or something that moves the planets by entire? So describe it to us.
Well, you would do the same thing you do with any of the outer planets. Like how would you do Pluto as far as solar arc? You would say there's a Pluto effect, there's a progression involving Pluto or direction involving Pluto. You can't do secondary, obviously, with these. So yeah, it's very similar to the way you'd work with Pluto. And it does have to do, okay, when Eris comes along, it does have to do with finding what's really deep and important for you and how you might be able to start to articulate that. Well, the thing that really surprised me when I began to realize that the transits were so important, Einstein was born with Eris pretty close, Eris in the 10th house, also the sun in the 10th house. Eris moved closer and closer to his sun degree in the subsequent years by transit. So by actual transit, now of course it touched his sun, moved away backward. It moves back and forth a couple of degrees every year from the motion of the Earth, from the retrogradation. So it would come closer, touch, move. It only moves forward in Aries about a quarter of a degree per year. If you look at subsequent stations of Eris, either station direct or a station retrograde, it moves a quarter of a degree each time. And that's because it's so far out in the aphelion that it takes 120 years to go through Aries. From 1920 until 2040, it's in Aries. So now it's working its way to it's like 23 degrees of Aries at this point, 24 it's gotten to. So 23, 24, but that's been also the story of 2015, 2016. It will be similar to that in 2020, the end in the December 21st of this year, when we have that very important solstice, that has Saturn and Jupiter together at the 0 degree mark of Aquarius. Eris is also at 23 degrees of Aries, and Pluto is at 23 degrees of Capricorn, so there's a perfect square. It's been square, in fact. We can talk about the mundane astrology of this Saturn-Pluto conjunction for the whole year as involving Eris and square. And this is so important. Can I launch into that?
Please.
So Eris is so important in regarding how this whole pandemic is shaping up, because what is Eris telling us? Eris is telling us that you have to, each individual counts, that you have to go inside yourself, forget about what the consensus thought is about something. You have to come from your own principles. You have to go inside yourself, find out what is your bottom line, and act upon that and strictly upon that. So how important is that in this pandemic? It's up to each individual to, if we're going to get past the pandemic, it's up to each individual to do the right thing. Everybody has to be on their own recognizance about this, right? You see what I'm saying? And I think it's so fascinating that it's exactly square. Really through the whole time, it's been pretty much square to the Saturn-Pluto, which recently in the summertime had a midpoint of 24 Capricorn, and Eris was at 24 Aries. So it's pretty important, I think, in looking at how these things work out. And by the way, another thing about this current transits, the current situation that's going on with the Saturn-Pluto, is that over the summer, Haumea was opposite Eris. Haumea was in 23, 24, 25, and now it's all the way up to 27 of Libra, opposite. So there's a T-square I saw coming for the summer with Eris opposite Haumea, making a T-square to the Saturn-Pluto. And I thought, wow, I wonder if the pandemic is going to get worse over the summer, and then it did. And now is kind of one of the strongest times with Jupiter also joining that configuration. Astrologers have been talking about that for years before 2020, that November was going to be kind of an intense time. And sure enough, we have the pandemic really surging.
Now, If there were another way that someone wanted to interact with Eris within their chart, what are some other ways for a person to really dive into the use of that energy, that symbolism, and the archetype that is Eris?
Well, the two major things within a natal chart, as you can imagine, are the house position and also the connections it makes to other planets. And if I see Eris is a very powerful factor when you look at the connections it makes to personal planets. If I see Eris with Mercury, they're a writer. It's almost invariable. If I see Eris with Venus, they're an appreciator of that maverick energy. So that's a very powerful one also. An example there, well, I won't go into that. If you look at Eris with Mars, there's a very masculine kind of presence, even in a woman. There's kind of a very strong energy, and it can be sexual, strong desire for sexual connection. Eris with the Sun, Gloria Steinem being a good example there. They have this kind of process where it's like they are the one that is going to be telling you what's going on. You know, they're going to be a leader. They're going to be somebody that really, it comes from their own understanding of things, never mind what the society might happen to think. And with the moon, it's very interesting because I think it does bring out a certain feminine quality, but it's also thinking outside the box. It's coming from a different way of observing and perceiving. And Einstein's a good example of that because he had Eris in partile trine with the moon, or was it square? One of those two. And with Einstein, you know, he had these thought experiments like chasing a beam of light. He was coming from a different way. And of course, obviously, the whole theory of relativity is a way of describing the physical universe in a completely new way, was coming from a different angle. So, in fact, was Carl Jung, who has the exact trine to the moon as well. Not exact. It's exact. Actually, Carl Jung has the exact trine to Mercury, and is also closely. I can't remember if it's a square to the moon. I'm not sure, but the moon is a factor for Jung, and he was kind of a iconoclast who saw things from a completely different way of looking at things, his own person. But with Mercury, it's so interesting because he was very articulate. He lectured in 3 languages. His complete collected works come to more than 18 volumes. You know, he was always writing, and he's also associated with the spirit Mercurius and the fact that he was involved in that in his alchemical studies later in his life. So you do see that. Now, interestingly, with Saturn, I haven't gotten to Saturn and Jupiter. So with Saturn, it seems to have a lot to do with the perfection of society. These people are very organized about what is fair. You know, it's defending the underdog. And I thought of Elizabeth Warren when I thought of this at one point, that she is such a person who wants to be fair and have everybody under the umbrella of inclusion, you know, and founded that consumer protection agency in Washington, D.C. So I said she must have it. And I go to look, and it's not obvious, but it is a biquintile within 1/10 of a degree between Eris and Saturn, as predicted by what I'm already seeing with all these other planets. So it's pretty important with the connections to the personal planets and to Uranus. And with Uranus, it's kind of got that side to it, you know, the idea of the maverick that wants to do things differently, and the trickster. Anyway.
And well, we could continue with Neptune and Pluto if you have information about those as well.
Eris with Pluto, they're really a bulldozer. I mean, these people, you find that they're just a handful. You know, they do have that. Kobe Bryant is an example. They do have that real stride, and that's a generational aspect. They both move so slowly, but especially if it's triggered by other planetary configurations. And then Eris with Neptune. I don't know too many examples of that, but you know, it would be that it brings out that Neptune quality. In other words, these people would be very sensitive, very psychically attuned, what you'd expect when you see strong Neptune.
What do you think the shape of the astrology of the 22nd century will look like? Because I know that you mentioned midpoints earlier, which definitely resonates with me because of my own practice of Uranian astrology. But as we move towards the future of astrology, what do you think that new future of our craft is going to look like, and how will it differ from the astrology that we practice now?
Well, I think 2200 is a hard one to figure. We really don't know what that's going to be like. But I do think that these definitely will have an archetypal presence in our Western astrology, because I just see the evidence all around. Whenever I look for it, I find it. It's really quite amazing. I think, oh, they should be strong. How may with that person? Sure enough. So that's quite interesting to me. And I do think that they will become established as part of our Western astrological work. I don't know what else will come along. I suspect it will be very different than what we have right now. Just in the same way that our thought right now is different than it was in 1900.
Is there anything else that you're doing or working on or researching within astrology that really moves you? And I'm asking this because you also mentioned biquintiles, and we know that lots of people view them as minor aspects, but I get the feeling that you don't. So,
Well, that was interesting to me. Yeah, I mean, there's the normal aspects that we always associate, and of course I was finding a lot of that. But there were times when I really felt there was a presence of these planets. I gave you one example. And I use a smaller orb with quintile, with biquintile. You could use septile. And you could use semi-square. So if you look at the examples in the book, there's quite a few times when it's a very close quintile, and that really does show what we're looking for. We're trying to see how, for example, Julia Butterfly Hill, who was quite an environmental activist, you know about her, right? So she climbed the tree, and you look at the transits of when she climbed the tree, and these nature planets are all over the place. Very close to, it's like partile. So with the connection. So yeah, I think that those minor aspects are important also, especially if they're close. I like to work with it when they're close.
and do you work with any of them on, say, a dial? We have the 360 dial and the 90-degree dial, or do you do any other work in terms of harmonics?
I am very traditional in the way I work. A lot of times I'm just looking at the aspects, and it takes me pretty far. And also the house positions. I haven't talked about the house, but it does really light up the house. I'm not so sure about Haume and Makemake because of my research not being as complete there, but with Eris, I know 100% that the house becomes important. So those are it's mostly just mama papa astrology, just for the planets and signs, houses. And I tend to use Placidus, by the way, but I do believe that whole sign is important.
Now, Henry, tell us, because I know that you said that you are open to doing a bit of teaching as well. So, if people wanted to really learn about this information, tell us where they can get a copy of your book, as well as tell us where can we study with you if we really want to go deeper in terms of understanding Eris and these newer outer planets.
And my own website is astrograph.com, which is also for the software. And we do have, you can do a lot of research, even just with time passages for the iPhone, because in that we also have the positions of all these new ones. They're something you can choose as an optional inclusion to the chart, so you can start to do your own research about how they work.
And you had mentioned earlier that you're also open to giving consultations as well. Can you tell our listeners and viewers whether or not they reach you for those consultations via Astrograph, or how do we get in contact with you for that?
Yeah, that is, Astrograph has a section called readings, or it might become, it's going to be called resources soon, but that's where you can sign up for a reading with me.
Awesome, Henry. Now, Henry, what else is it that you're working on, that you're excited for people to know about, that you really would like for the astrologers of today to really dig their heels into?
Well, I do think that these new ones are so fascinating, and I think they do speak to our times, um, especially Eris. I mean, just look at where Eris is in your natal chart and try to meditate on that, see how it connects with your other planets, because it's a clue to a very important factor, not just, oh, what can I find out about myself, but what is my soul intention? What am I here for? Because we're all here for something. We're all here in this lifetime for a reason. And just even opening up to that is true, just to know that that is true is so powerful and so important. It really kind of cures that feeling of helplessness when we feel like there's all these uh, big social movements that we have a hard time seeing how we fit into it or how we have any agency. You know, they just seem to sweep along and do what they do, and we just kind of. But if you are really sure about what you believe, what you deeply understand to be your truth, and acting upon that truth to whatever extent you can make it happen, which, by the way, Marianne Williamson was just articulating at this thing called the Shift Summit that happened in September, which is a great thing. The shift is a great thing. I can't remember details about that. I'm not that familiar with it, but she gave a great talk, and she said, look, everybody's got to recognize what is their part. How can I do my part that counts, and make it count? And you know, it might be you can talk about it. It might be you can do this. It might be you can organize. It might be you can do that. Voting is very important. Blah blah blah. You know, and she just was really articulating that what I say all the time too, which is find out what your real métier is. You know, what have you got inside that nobody else has? That's you, and how can you find a way to articulate and to act upon that in the world? And it's a complete cure because for the helpless feeling, because you know you're doing your part, you're doing what you can do, and that's all you can do is your best, and all you can do is what you're coming to your most authentic self, I believe, in that way. So it's pretty important for these times, especially these divisive political times.
Henry, it's truly been a pleasure speaking with you today, and I am so grateful that we connected, and I'm so grateful for the work that you're doing because we have so many things coming into our astrology, and I think that what we need is people who are willing to do the work and do the research in order to determine essentially whether or not astrologically these things have any effect within the greater sphere of our astrology or whether they don't. And I think that you're really out there doing the work for what you've proven to be truthful and significant within your own practice. And I'm sure that many people are going to benefit from that. So thank you so much.
Thank you for saying.
You're very welcome, Henry. And to those of our listeners and viewers out there, if this is your 100th time joining us here on the Oraculos podcast, or if this is time number 1, I just want to say thank you from the bottom of my heart for continuing to come here and share in this virtual astrological space with us. I receive your comments, your feedback, your encouragement, but most importantly, I receive your love. So if you want to continue to be a part of the magic and the momentum that we're building over here on the Oraculos podcast, please do, yes, subscribe to the podcast, but also share the Oraculos podcast with your other astrologically and magically minded friends, because more and more people need to know about the amazing work that we're doing here with these amazing astrologers from all around the world. So until next time, I'm your host, Mychal A. Bryan, leaving you in peace and love and hope. Until we meet again, have a good one. Bye-bye. Henry Seltzer.